into the river, destroyed completely, never to be recovered again. You cannot imagine what that means. I collect books, I collect manuscripts, I know what that means. I know what that means. When you lose one manuscript, written by hand by a Muslim scholar, or any scholar for that matter. So Baghdad was destroyed. This is a dinar of Caliph al-Musta'sim, the last Abbasid Caliph in Muslim history. You can see his name there, al-Musta'sim Billah. And this particular dinar was actually minted during the siege of Baghdad, when Baghdad was besieged. This is a very expensive dinar. It was sold in an auction for a lot of money recently, because it was actually minted when the siege was still in place. Because of the date, it is the last year of the Caliph's 656 is there, the date is there, 656 Hijri, in the last months. So what happened to the Caliph? Having seen the destruction with his own eyes, having seen the killing of his own children, his own sisters imprisoned, he was kicked to death. He was rolled into a carpet, and there are, according to some of the reports, he was thrown into a dungeon with his treasure where he had gold and silver, and he was asked by the Mongols to eat that gold that you kept and did not spend on military development. Gold that you kept and did not spend on army, eat it now. I don't know how authentic these reports are, but there are reports that he was rolled into a carpet, a Mongol way of killing dignitaries, a Mongol way of soft death. He was rolled into a carpet and he was trampled over by horses or kicked to death. Al-Musta'sim Billah, the last Caliph of Baghdad, died in this way. Then 2 years later came a very good news for the Muslims. Again, cut the long story short, I think the lecture has already gone on for a very long time. I want to quickly talk about what happened afterwards. Mongols were a test from Allah. They were a trial from Allah. Call it a punishment for Muslim negligence towards Islam. Call it a trial, a test. It may be anything. We don't know what Allah meant to do. Allah's hikmah, Allah's wisdom is with him. Whether Allah was trying to teach Muslims a lesson, whether Allah was trying to change the course of history, whether Allah was trying to reshuffle because we believe in Allah's hikmah. You know, we are not like atheists that, oh, bad things happen, therefore there is no God. Actually, when something happens, you know someone exists, right? If you are in a dark room and you get a slap, what's the first conclusion? What's the first conclusion? There is someone else there. Do you understand? If you are in a dark room alone and then you get a chanda, you know what that means, yeah? Yeah? In the Punjabi language, that means a hard Pakistani slap. You know? The one you, with a loose hand, yeah? You know, in Pakistan when people fight, they slap each other. Before the punches, not that I'm trying to promote this part or this side of the Pakistani culture, because I grew up in Pakistan. I used to see that very often. When people fight, the first thing that happens is a slap. People think that's feminine, but that's actually not. That's part of the culture, right? So, if you get a slap in a dark room, you know there is someone else there. This is what we say, that how we know that Allah exists is because of وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. Yeah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, إِنَّا فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. In the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the changing of the night and the day, there are signs for those who contemplate. So when things happen and your planet still carries on despite something like tsunami, like big earthquakes, big catastrophes, and your planet still continues, life is still going on, the sun is still shining, the moon still survives. There are earthquakes on the moon. People say, why are they happening? I say they are happening because Allah is trying to show you that this happens, and despite this happening, you still live. you still live. The one who created you, he gives you a shake, every now and then. Wake up. I'm the one who created you. I'm the one who's sustaining you. Because any more of this can cause your life to collapse. You only get enough of a shake for you to realize, for you to wake up. So, in 1260, the Mongols were making their way towards Syria, and they had taken parts of Syria. They had taken the city of Damascus, and many Muslims had been captured. And what the Mongols would do very often is to use the captives to fight against the Muslim brothers. And if they did not fight against the Muslim brothers, they would be killed. Sometimes Muslim captives were used as human shields in wars. So when there's a war going on, there are arrows coming down, they would hold the Muslim in front of them so that he's shot. So Mongols had these very barbaric tactics. What were their military tactics? They wore very light armor, and in their clothes they would wear a silk shirt. Right? When an arrow would penetrate the body, they would easily pull out the arrow with the silk shirt. Right? It would bring it out. So they had very genius ideas, simple ideas. They used shorter horses. It were the Mongol horses that enabled them to do what they did. These were some of the military tactics they had. They traveled very light. They rode very light. Other armies against them would come in armor, like with iron, big iron things hanging on them, and they would find it very difficult to fight. But the Mongols had certain tactics. They had charging horses with archers, something which the Mughals used later on, and they conquered India by doing that. Babur, the first Mughal emperor. A lot of these tactics were borrowed later on by other military establishments. In 1260, to cut the long story short, the Muslims of Egypt, who were governed by a people later on called the Mamluks, literally the owned ones, the possessed ones, because they were slaves who had become king. Right? There were two slave dynasties in the history of Islam, whereby slaves became kings. Right? These slaves came from Turkic background. They were very similar ethnically to the Mongols. Right? They were bought specifically for one purpose. They were trained in military arts so that they can become helpers to their masters. Usually, sultans, kings would buy slaves and train them in military arts so that they can have their loyalty. Sultans in the Middle Ages, in the Middle East in particular, couldn't always rely on the loyalty of their own tribes and their cousins and their uncles. So for that reason, to avoid that trouble, they would buy 1,000 slaves, 2,000 slaves from Central Asian markets and train them in military arts. And some of these slaves would become so good that they would become generals, and from generals eventually they became sultans. This happened in two places. One was Egypt, where the Mamluks governed, and the other place was, who knows? Go on, impress me. Impress me with your history.
Syria.
A place very far from Egypt and Syria.
Pakistan.
Yeah, that's quite far.
China.
India.
India.
The Delhi Sultanate. I said it first. The Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate, which consisted of entirely of slaves governing as kings. Very powerful monarchs governed from the year 1200 onwards, and they remained in power in some shape or another until 1526, when the Mughals came in. When Mughals came in and removed the slave dynasty from power. So the last slave dynasty in India was the Lodi dynasty, and the first powerful king of the slave dynasty in India was a man called Qutbuddin Aybak. It's a very Turkish name. He was a Turkic slave, also bought from Central Asian markets and trained in military arts, who after the death of his master, who was Shahabuddin Ghori, Muhammad bin Sam Shahabuddin Ghori, who had fought many major battles in northern India, against some Hindu kings. When he died, and you know where he's buried? Who's from Gujar Khan here? Mirpur? Gujar Khan?
Yeah.
You're from Gujar Khan? Wow. You know Shahabuddin Ghori is actually buried in your city.
Yeah.
When you go back next time, ask them where is Ghori's tomb. They will take you there. He was killed there, he was buried there. He was assassinated in his tent. He was one of the major invaders of North India. Okay? And then when he died, his very slave named Qutbuddin Aibak came to power. This happened in 1206, and Aibak governed for 4 years, and he fell from his horse playing something like polo. He fell from his horse in Lahore, and then he died, and he's buried in a place called Anarkali in Lahore. Okay? Then came to power Sultan Shamsuddin Iltutmish, who was also a Turkic slave belonging to the same clan. He governed for the next almost 26 years until 1236. Then his daughter Radia Sultana came to power for 4 years, who was a woman, the first woman ruler in the history of Islam in India. Okay, she was very effective, very famous, very well known. There are dramas and movies made on her. Her coins are very expensive, very rare coins. Okay, and then came to power another man after her, one of the most powerful figures in Indian history in those times. And now when these people are governing, when Iltutmish, his daughter, and the Sultan that came after, Ghiyasuddin Balban, when these guys are governing, the Mongols are invading India non-stop. They're invading India, and these sultans are fighting against the Mongols, protecting India. You know, when you hear this narrative on the Indian news in the mouths of Hindutva activists and extremist right-wing Hindu, in some cases terrorists, when you hear them on the news, on Indian channels, that Muslims, they brought nothing but suffering to India, they decimated the population. If the Muslims did not defend India against Mongol invasions, just one favor of Muslims, forget about everything else. Forget about all the Muslim libraries, all the Muslim scholars, all the poetry in Persian, all the books written in Sanskrit during the Muslim rule. Audrey Trusk is a scholar who has written a book to prove this very point, that under the Muslim rules, when the Mughals were governing India, the Hindus and the culture and the language flourished. There was a Sanskrit renaissance due to the Mughal rule, right? So all of this, put it aside, one favor alone of the Muslim sultans towards India is enough for Indians to appreciate. And what is that? Resisting against Mongol invasions at a cost which was very, very heavy. To cite one case in particular, Mongols invaded Lahore when Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban, also a Turkic sultan belonging to the slave class who had become the king of India, North India. And these were very strong, observant Muslims. They were very strong Muslims, these people. They had weaknesses, no doubt. They had personal weaknesses. They probably did drink. They probably did have their dance sessions and all that. That was part of ruling at the time, right? But they had very strong attachment to Islam at the same time. The Sultan had a son called Prince Muhammad, who was the governor of Multan. Multan was a major center of Muslim civilization in the Indian subcontinent. So the governor of Multan was the very son of the Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban, and Prince Muhammad was the Waliul Ahad. He was the heir apparent after his father. So he was given a message that the Mongols are very close to Lahore. They are attacking the city of Lahore. So the prince decided to confront them. And the information or the intelligence he was given was that there are 3,000. A zero was unfortunately missed. Okay? He had no idea. 3,000, baby job. Let's go. So he went to fight the Mongols. Near Lahore, this battle took place. When he got there, he realized a zero was missing from intelligence. It were 30,000 Mongols. And that means a heavy force. Looking at the Mongols, he went with a small force to subdue this. He was besieged, he fought, and he was killed in battle. Sultan Ghiyasuddin Balban never recovered from this loss. He loved his son dearly, and he gave his own son to protect India against Mongols. If the Mongols were allowed to come to India, the history of India would have been completely different. Who knows, they would have destroyed every single temple, mosque, place of worship standing like they did everywhere else. But Muslims defended India against the Mongols. And in this very battle, there was a very famous poet present named Amir Khusro. Very well-known Persian poet who lived in Delhi. And he documents what he saw. He even explains and describes the Mongols, how smelly and disgusting they were. Their hygiene was bad, their manners were bad, and they were like not humans. They were like creatures from somewhere else. And of course, Muslims are very civilized, very clean, very civilized in their manners and their behavior and the way they did things. They saw Mongols against their own prejudice, Muslims, because they saw themselves. So this is what happened in India. Coming back to the Battle of Ain Jalut. Ain Jalut, similarly, there were Mamluks from the same background governing Egypt. They had come to power coincidentally at the same time in Egypt. So there were two Mamluk dynasties, because this phenomenon intensified. Which phenomenon? Buying of slaves and training them in military arts. It intensified in the 13th century. And this was the outcome. The outcome was slave kings who became so powerful that they became kings. They became the sultans, right? So, in this case, the sultan was Saifuddin al-Quds, or Al-Qutuz. Qutuz was actually sold into slavery, but he was not Turkic. But the man who supported him in the battle strongly was a man called Baybars. I'm finishing very soon. In the next 3 to 4 minutes, I'll finish, inshallah. I don't have a watch. Okay, so I'll finish very soon so that we can go to Q&A, inshallah. Because the problem is, the information is so much that I cannot possibly cover everything. So, Qutuz, he decided that he will confront the Mongols. Cut the long story short, he asked for the Muslims to support him. Many refused to support him because they feared the Mongols, or they had joined the Mongols against the Muslims of Egypt. Mongols were definitely making their way towards Egypt. Egypt was very rich and the Mongols had their eyes on Egypt, and strategically Egypt is standing between the East and the West. The Western civilization of Islam was completely in what? North Africa and Spain. And the Mongols had their eyes on that as well. They had no idea as to what's there, and they were looking to go into North Africa and Spain. So who was standing in the middle? Egypt, governed by Mamluks. Cut the long story short, Qutuz decides that he will fight a battle outside. He goes outside to fight a battle near Palestine, near a place called Ain Jalut. This battlefield was about 65 kilometers away from the very famous battlefield of Hittin, where Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi had some years ago, some decades ago, defeated the Crusaders, and the 60 kilometers away from the very famous battlefield called Yarmouk, where the Sahaba fought the Romans. So this place was very strategically chosen by Qutuz. He got there first, so he got the advantage of choosing the battlefield. And he had strategically placed his people. He deliberately sent a very small portion of his army to fight the Mongols first, led by none other than Sultan Baybars, later on, who came to power after Qutuz had been killed. Qutuz, by the way, was killed immediately after this battle, unfortunately, by his own generals. This is a dilemma. This is a problem we had faced throughout in Muslim history. This internal fighting and killing of effective leaders to just come to power. So Qutuz was killed soon after, and Baybars came to power. Baybars was the man who eventually got rid of the Crusaders from the Holy Land. In 1291, he besieged the city of Acre and eventually took the city from the Crusaders. So in this battle, he sent Baybars forward. So the Mongols thought this is a very small army. So they came into the battlefield entirely. Ketbuga, who was a Mughal general at the time, he wanted to wipe out the Muslim army once and for all and completely decimate the entire. But Qutuz had a different plan. He had hidden the bulk of the army behind the mountains, waiting for the Mongols to come into the valley completely and then to shock them. And amazingly, when this was happening, Qutuz dismounted his own horse and he went forward fighting with his men on foot. And when his soldiers saw the king fighting in person on foot, they were completely, inspired and, influenced by this very action, and they fought hard. And the Mongols were, for the first time in their history, were shocked. And Mongols were not known for leaving the battlefield. They were not known for running from the battlefield. They were very, very difficult opponents. And Qutuz had then shocked the Mongols in this battle. Muslim armies came down from the mountains and the Mongol army was completely uprooted and decimated, and they were on the run. And then another battle took place 20 kilometers away where the Muslims were able to overpower the rest of the Mongol army. So, or such was the Battle of Ain Jalut. After the destruction of Baghdad, 1258, 2 years later, this battle took place in Palestine, and that stopped the Mongol advance eastwards forever. Mongols were not able to take Egypt ever. They were not able to take any more land in North Africa and by extension Spain. But they continued taking land in the east, and then later on a lot of these Mongols and their children became Muslims. The very people who came to destroy Islam got conquered by Islam when they realized that their ways are not better than Islam and Muslims. They became Muslims. Many powerful Mongol leaders embraced Islam, and having come as destroyers, they turned into defenders of Islam in the very next century, and they became very powerful rulers. Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayhi was born 3 years after this very battle. In 1263, Ibn Taymiyyah was born, and when he grew up, he saw the Mongols invading his territory. As a child, he saw what's happening. His father and his family migrated to the city of Damascus due to Mongol invasions from Haran, which is in current-day Turkey. So Ibn Taymiyyah had migrated to Damascus, and he grew up seeing the Mongol invasions and their cruelty and the barbarity. And later on, he himself was found on the battlefield fighting some of the Mongols who had become Muslims. One of the problems with Mongols was that because they were militarily and politically dominant, they, even though had come to Islam, had still allegiance to the ways of Genghis Khan. They still referred to his book Al-Yasa or Al-Yasik as an authority over them, right? And this is why some of the scholars of Islam, they said they're not truly Muslim, because they haven't actually submitted to Sharia completely. They don't really believe that Sharia is superior to Al-Yasik. They still refer back to the ways of Genghis Khan for inspiration and authority. Therefore, Ibn Taymiyyah and scholars like him fought the Mongols in the coming decades. And later on, Mongols slowly, gradually lost their power, and many of their cities and their territories that they were governing were either taken over by other Muslim kings or other Muslim tribes or other Central Asian Muslim powers like the Mughals and the Safavids who came to power in Iran, and they applied Shiaism in the country of Iran. So I will stop here for now. This is Mongol invasions in a nutshell. This was still a brief history and introduction. The details are far too much for me to cover in a short lecture like this, and we will go straight to Q&A. Thank you so much for listening. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.